I was a pretty brave person when I was younger, or maybe I had that sense of invincibility that comes with youth. I'd survived some pretty intense things. A stalker who pursued my sister and I for over a year and a half, being sexually assaulted, 2 house fires, and growing up in a house that I swear to you was haunted. Not in that Disney way either. I'm talking torture chamber in the basement and strange things going on. Anyway, I suppose looking back, that having been through all that made me feel a little like either I was sort of invincible, or maybe I just assumed that I've gotten all the bad stuff out of the way, and nothing else would happen. Whatever it was, I learned to know better. When I was 17, I didn't have a driver's license. In fact, I was 36 before I ever did. I walked to most places, occasionally catching rides with friends, and less occasionally hitchhiking. The night in question was one of those seldom seen occasions when I decided to hitchhike, having worked late and being too exhausted to walk. Now, most of the time when I'd hitch a ride, I wouldn't get in the car with a lone man. Only women, or rarely men with a wife or girlfriend and or kids in the car. This night, though, cars were few and far between, and it was cold. And really, if I'm being perfectly frank, when he pulled over, I took a good look and figured I could take him if he tried anything. He was on the slender side, and had a strange frailness about him, even though he looked to be healthy enough. I got into the car after we agreed on a destination. We exchanged names, and I warmed my fingers in the front of the heating vent. He spoke quietly, asking a few questions along the lines of if I was a local, and how I liked living here. He said he'd only been there a couple of months, but found it beautiful and hoped that he could find happiness there. That comment struck me as a little odd, but I brushed it off. It began to snow, and the road quickly got slippery, so he slowed and kept his eyes straight out the windshield, driving silently. I was okay with that, as small talk had never been my forte. About 10 minutes later, I noticed a car near the intersection we were approaching seemed to be sliding, so I yelled, "Watch out!" He immediately hit the gas, shooting through the intersection, and burst out with, "Don't ever scream at me." Needless to say, I was taken aback. I said, "Look, this is close enough. Just pull over here and I can get there myself." He didn't seem to hear me. Richard, did you hear me? I said you can pull over here and let me out now." No response. He just stared straight ahead, driving faster now than he had been since it began to snow. To say I was scared doesn't seem to cover the depth of fear that began to arise in me. I didn't know if I should stay quiet or speak, but I was damn sure not going to yell after his outburst. After going about a mile, he began to mumble under his breath. I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but I assumed he was speaking to me. So I said, I couldn't hear you." He began to speak, quietly and rapidly, saying things like, "You're always yelling at me. I've told you time and time again, I don't appreciate being yelled at. But do you listen? No. Well, I'm done listening to you now. Do you hear that?" I was at a complete loss. I didn't know what to say in response, or if I should say anything at all. I contemplated just jumping out of the car, but nixed that idea when I realized the door lock was missing. There was just a silver-lined hole where it should have been. I started to cry and debate with myself about causing an accident by grabbing the wheel and hoping for the best. At least, I figured, there was a chance I'd survive that. He suddenly looked at me for the first time since I'd gotten into the car. He blinked several times, rapidly, then slowed the car, pulling into the gas station. I waited to see if he'd unlock the doors, not wanting to say anything and risk setting him off again. After about a minute or two, he quietly said, "I think I'd better let you out here," and hit the button to open the locks. I wasn't about to hesitate. I jumped out of the car as if it were on fire. I was about to turn and walk into the gas station when he called my name. He looked so damn sad, so I hesitated. He apologized. He said he was sorry if he'd frightened me, that he would never have harmed me, and asked if I'd be able to get home okay. I said that I would, and closed the door. He began to pull out of the gas station lot, but stopped suddenly. He just sat there for a couple of minutes, his head down. I froze, wondering what the hell he was up to, and was about to run into the station, but he opened his window and yelled at me, waving something in his hand. My hat. I had left it on his seat. I warily approached his side of the car, and he handed it to me, apologizing again. I didn't know what else to say, so I just said thank you. I watched as he drove off, making sure he was out of sight before moving on so he wouldn't know which direction I was heading. I decided to go to a friend's instead of my home. As I walked, I went to put my hat back on, and out fell a piece of paper. Folded into the paper was a $100 bill. The paper said, "I'm sorry. Please take a cab, and don't hitchhike anymore." I didn't. In fact, that was the last time I ever hitched a ride alone. When I was a teenager, I lived in a small town located about 30 miles south of Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't get my driver's license or my first car until I was almost 20 years old, so between the ages of 16 and 19, I hitchhiked pretty frequently. This was in the early 70s, when people still hitchhiked, and many drivers were still willing to pick people up, in spite of the dangers and risks posed to both sides. For the most part, I never had any trouble with the people who offered me rides, but occasionally I would get picked up by someone who would totally creep me out. This is a story about one creepy ride I accepted, and how 25 years later, I would discover to my great shock that I may have been much luckier at the time than I had ever imagined. This incident occurred sometime in the summer of 1974, when I was 17 years old. At that time, I was 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, a blonde-hair and blue-eyed guy who didn't have any trouble connecting with girls for dates. In fact, my story begins with me standing on the side of the highway with my thumb out, as I was trying to get back home after spending the weekend with my girlfriend, who lived in downtown Atlanta. I was traveling south, away from the city, and out into the country where I lived with my parents. I recall that I'd only had my thumb out for about 15 minutes, when a man with a big white Lincoln Town Car, a very large and expensive car at the time, pulled over. As I walked up, I scanned the inside and looked at the driver, trying to size the situation up as I always did, just to be safe. What I saw was a tidy car with a man in the driver's seat, who looked to be in his late 30s or mid-40s, dressed in an expensive suit and tie. He had short black hair, wore black-rimmed eyeglasses, and appeared to be rather on the thin side with a gaunt face and dark eyes. I never learned his name, but for the sake of this story, we'll call him Town Carman. When I got up to the passenger side of the car, I leaned down toward the open window and told him where I was heading to. I asked him if he was going to go that far, to which he replied in a soft voice that he was, and waved me to get inside. I was not at all wary of him, as by all appearances he was just an ordinary middle-class businessman, and I opened the door and got into the front seat next to him, without any hesitation. Generally, when I accepted rides from strangers while hitchhiking, I liked to try to engage them in chat, sort of as a way to pay them for the ride by providing good conversation, and also to put them at ease about picking me up by showing them that I was harmless and not a creep. However, when I began trying to chat with Town Carman in my normal fashion, with typical small talk, I instantly started getting bad vibes from him. I could tell he was mostly ignoring what I was saying, and instead trying to steer the conversation towards asking me personal questions about myself, such as how old I was, where I went to school, if I had a girlfriend, and the like. I tried to answer as politely as possible, without really giving away much real information. But Town Carman kept getting more and more personal, asking questions that hinted at whether or not I was sexually active with my girlfriend, telling me that when he was my age, he went around horny about the half the time, and had always been on the lookout for sexual adventures. As the ride progressed, and we were going further and further out into the country, I began to get very uneasy, as I started to sense that something was not quite right with him. We had left the populated city behind, and were now traveling down an old 2-lane highway through countryside that was sparsely populated. There seemed to be hardly any other cars in the road. The more that Town Carman asked me questions about myself, wanting to know very personal things about me, like if I'd ever had sex with my girlfriend, all while glancing over at me from time to time with sort of a creepy knowing look in his eye. It was like he was privately enjoying some dirty secret that only he knew about, and I became more uncomfortable. I don't know how better to describe it than that, and it really began to make me feel uneasy, as his manner seemed very cagey, and I totally sensed that there was some underlying motive in his questioning. It really put me on guard. I began to think about what I should do next, as in, should I ask him to pull me over and let me out, even though I was only about half the way to my destination and out in the middle of nowhere? For the first time, I began to realize just how vulnerable I was. But what really made me start to feel uneasy was when he started asking me if I wanted a drink of liquor, indicating that he had several bottles with him in the trunk, and that if I wanted some, he would pull over to the side of the road and mix me up a stiff drink. Because I was growing more and more uncomfortable, I declined his offer, saying that I did not drink, which was a lie. Even at that age, I was already regularly drinking with friends. But he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he kept insisting that I should really just have one drink, because he was such a great drink mixer, and it would only take him a minute for him to fix a very special one for me. After I had declined his offer for something like the 4th time, he abruptly changed tactics again. He began telling me a story about when he was my age and a young guy in the army. He told me how he used to hitchhike a lot too, and that he would sometimes get picked up by men who wanted to pay him with money to have sex with them. He asked if anything like that had ever happened to me. By this time, I had quite enough of all of this, and looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, that's never happened to me, and nobody had better offer that to me ever." Well, the knowing look vanished instantly from his face, and I could tell he was irked by how I had just reacted to his story. That exchange between us totally changed the dynamic inside the car, and he became very quiet. After a few minutes of this uneasy silence, he spoke up and told me that he was turning at the next intersection, and that I would need to get out of there, even though he had told me when he first picked me up that he was going my entire way. At this point, I was very relieved, and now only wanted to get out of the car. When the car came to a stop, I had just barely gotten out and pushed the door closed when he stepped onto the gas and zoomed off, literally jerking the handle of the car out of my hand. I remember that I stood there watching him drive away until he had disappeared down the road, and that my heart was beating very fast. I was both scared and angry at what had just happened. After I calmed down, I resumed hitchhiking until I got another ride that took me home without further incident. Fast forward 25 years. It's 1999, and I had all but forgotten about my creepy ride with Town Carman. I'm on the internet, reading through a true crime website, when I stumbled onto a story about an ultra-creepy guy named Robert Bennett, a man who had been arrested after a series of vicious attacks on men who he'd picked up in his car, drugged, handcuffed, and then set their genitals on fire with a flammable liquid. The attacks took place over a 20-year period, starting around 1968 in the Atlanta area, and ending with his arrest in 1991. Prior to Bennett's arrest, this attacker became known as the Handcuff Man, and talk within the local gay community was that he was targeting men who he thought were gay prostitutes. And when I saw the photo of Bennett that accompanied the article, my jaw dropped open, and the memories of my ride that day in 1974 came flooding back. I was certain I was looking at a picture of Town Car Man and was absolutely floored. I don't have any way to prove that the creepy guy who picked me up was in fact this Robert Bennett, but the physical resemblance between what I remember about Town Car Man and the photo of Bennett is absolutely uncanny, and the persistent offer by him to mix me a special drink and his questions about whether or not I ever had sex with men for money also seems to indicate that was a possibility. I should point out that even though this story took place in the early 70s in the deep south of Georgia, I was actually okay with gay people at the time, even knew a few people back then who were gay. So I didn't have a problem with homosexuality at all, but being heterosexual, I had zero interest in having sex with other men, and even if I had been game for that sort of thing, I found it highly distasteful when people assumed that they could just act in such an unwanted, cagey fashion regarding sexual matters with complete strangers. I have and always will find that to be extremely creepy. My dad is one of those people who has had about 20 different lives. Every so often, some random topic comes up, and he'll go, "Oh yeah, he almost died doing that." This is one of those stories. As a young man in the 1970s, my dad hitchhiked all over the US and Canada. He has plenty of good, bad, and ugly stories from his hitchhiking years, but this is one of the scariest I've heard him tell. He was hitching with a girlfriend of his at the time. They were both in their early 20s and making their way across Canada. A car with 4 men in it picks them up on a fairly unpopulated highway. They recognized that the men must have been from a nearby Indian reservation, yet they never spoke a word of English to them, just gestured a ride. My dad squeezes in between the 2 guys in the front seat, and his girlfriend is squished between the 2 other guys in the back. My dad said the pickup happened very quickly. The seating arrangement, not what he would have chosen, but whatever. They were getting a free ride. Then, as they start to drive, all of a sudden my dad realizes that everyone in the car is really drunk. The whole car reeks of alcohol, and the men start talking to each other loudly in their native language, and my dad can just tell they're absolutely wasted. He looks at the driver, who appears to be the least intoxicated, and is trying to decide how to tastefully tell them to drop my dad and his girlfriend off again, even though they had just been picked up a minute ago, when his girlfriend starts screaming from the back seat. Both of the men on either side of her had started groping her, and very roughly. She was trapped between them. My dad turns around and starts to yell at the guy and reach back there, but the other front seat passenger, who's not the driver, starts to grope my dad. My dad starts screaming and swinging around at everyone, but there's not much room in the car and he's vastly outnumbered, and the guy next to him is still trying to get in his pants. One of the guys in the back seat whips out a knife and holds it to my dad's girlfriend's throat. Before my dad can hardly react to that, the driver, remember the least drunk one and the only one who hadn't violated anyone at this point, turns around, hands off the wheel, and starts punching the knife-holding man really hard right in the face. Stupefied, the guy drops the knife and everyone kind of shuts up except my dad, who's still yelling, and his girlfriend, who's pretty much hysterical at this point. The driver promptly pulls over, and my dad and his girlfriend tumble out of the car, shaking, barely managing to get their bags out as well before the car speeds off again. As soon as the car from hell drove off, my dad desperately flagged down the next car to come along and told the driver what had just happened. And the driver lets them in for a ride and tells them he actually works at the reservation where those guys clearly lived. Trying to calm my dad's girlfriend down, he tells them it was unlikely the men would have actually raped her. Apparently, drunken groping was a problem on the reservation, but not rape. Whether this was actually true or not is a mystery to me. But then he turns to my dad very seriously and says, "You, on the other hand, you're lucky. They found a guy out here just last week who had been hitchhiking, and he was castrated." What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, as well as perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story that you'd like to submit, or you'd like to just send me a message, links to all of my social media will be in the description for the video below. This includes my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the theme of the story is, if it has any, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you're curious at all about the music used in this video, the music is always listed in the description below, in the order which it appears. I also have links to the artists and list the tracks by name, just in case you want to find more of their work. Last but not least, if you have any criticism, please be sure to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.